What's up, NBA fan? What's up, all sports fans? This your boy JB, host of the Behind the Bench podcast networking channel. Giving a shout out to the rest of the crew: Shad, Kelvin, Jermaine, KB Film Room, Big Dog Talk Sports. That's right. For everyone who's tuning in, thank you for supporting Behind the Bench. Subscribe to the channel. Help make this show the best that it can be. Now, let's talk some NBA, National Basketball Association, in particular. This is a topic that I brought up in previous videos from last year, but I want to just kind of do an update and to expound on it a little more. And this is about the notion that NBA expansion of the 90s made the league weak and less competitive. But if you pull back, if you really look at it, first of all, the era they're referring to as they try to discredit Michael Jordan's career and the dominant run that he had as the leader of the Chicago Bulls, winning 6 championships in 8 seasons. Really, that wave of expansion, it didn't start in the 90s. It actually started in 1988. The 88-89 season is when that new wave of modern expansion started, and that precluded the Pistons, the bad boy Detroit Pistons championship run when they went back-to-back in 1989 and 1990. So that's the first thing. Let's get that out the way. And this is not to discredit the Pistons at all, because the point of this video is to really highlight and show that expansion was not a sign of weakness per se, of making the league weak. It actually is a sign of growth. During the 80s, during the early 80s, you had expansion. You had new teams being added to the league, such as the Dallas Mavericks or whatnot. So it just, and a lot of the teams from the ABA, like the San Antonio Spurs, the Indiana Pacers, the Denver Nuggets, you know, they all was a carryover from the ABA, the American Basketball Association, when the ABA disbanded in 1976. So really, these are instances that made the NBA stronger. And when that expansion started in 1988, it started with 4 teams in the United States: the Miami Heat, the Charlotte Hornets, and then in 1989, they expanded 2 more teams: the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Orlando Magic. Okay. So if you look at it, number one, expansion did not dilute the talent pool. Now, I will say this. As a teenager coming up as a fan during the 80s, when that notion was posed, initially I did believe it. Because, you know, when something like that takes place, something newfound, in your mind, you may think in a generalized sense, you know, status quo per se. But as you see it start to unfold, then it proved to be otherwise. What I mean is, if you look at teams now, look at the Oklahoma City Thunder. This is a team that went to the postseason in 2020, right? Led by Chris Paul. They had just traded Paul George to the Los Angeles Clippers for Sage Gilgeous-Alexander, the same Sage Gilgeous-Alexander that is the leading candidate for league MVP this season. He was the runner-up last year to Nikola Jokic. This is the same Sage Gilgeous-Alexander that very few people thought would turn into what we see today out of him. Okay, now check this out. After Oklahoma City Now, mind you, Kevin Durant had already left as a free agent in 2016. You still had Russell Westbrook for the next 3 seasons. He asked to be traded to the Houston Rockets. So he was gone. Kevin Durant was gone. Serge Ibaka, I believe, was traded to the Toronto Raptors. He was gone. Thabo Sefolosha was gone. He went elsewhere. I believe he went to the Atlanta Hawks. I could be wrong in that, but I'm thinking Atlanta Hawks. So all of the cornerstone players from the 2010s were gone. So you start this new decade out, and after they traded Chris Paul, do you realize the next like 3 years, they was winning like 20-some games, 24 games, 25 games. And then during the 22-23 season, they made a jump and went 40. I believe that the record was 40-42. And then last year, boom, here they go. They take off. They win 57 games. They clinch the number 1 seed in the West. And this year, they're definitely going to surpass their record and clinch the number 1 seed in the West for the 2nd straight year. Do you realize that is now this is an established franchise, Oklahoma City, right? Okay. Do you realize that's about how long it took for those expansion teams to improve and become playoff caliber, such as the Miami Heat, such as the Orlando Magic, such as the Charlotte Hornets? And then by the late 90s, the Minnesota Timberwolves, who drafted Kevin Garnett in 1994, and then about 3 years later, they brought in Stephon Marbury. And then by the late 90s, they became a playoff level team. But 3 out of the initial 4 expansion teams from 1988-89, they became playoff level. That's about the same timeline as an established franchise starting over again. You see what I'm saying? So when you compare the success and the improvement of an expansion team compared to a long-standing franchise such as Oklahoma City Thunder, who originally existed in Seattle as the Seattle Sonics, you can see that the notion that expansion made the league weak is really a misnomer. It's really a misnomer. So let's dig deeper into this. Okay. Number 2, most of your top collegiate players in the nation. I'm talking about elite level college players, like 2-time All-American level players, such as the Ronnie Cycles, the Glenn Rices, the Cary Grants. Glenn Rice won a national title in 1989 for the University of Michigan, and he was drafted by the Miami Heat. You know what I'm saying? Larry Johnson won a national title with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, or UNLV Running Rebels in 1990. Then went back to the Final Four the next year, undefeated, only to get upset by the Duke Blue Devils. That same Larry Johnson got drafted by the Charlotte Hornets, who was an expansion team. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of Shaquille O'Neal of LSU, Louisiana State University. He, along with Chris Jackson, dominated the college scene in the NCAA. They never did go to the Final Four. They went to like the Elite 8, but nonetheless, everybody knows Shaq was coming out as number 1 pick of the 92 draft. He got picked up and drafted by an expansion team, the Orlando Magic. So a lot of your top collegiate players, during that period, they got selected and drafted by the expansion team. Nick Anderson, University of Illinois. The same Nick Anderson who was on, along with Kendall Gill, they played for the University of Illinois, the Fighting Illini, coached by Lou Hudson, and they went to the Final Four in 1989 and got upset by the same Michigan Wolverine team led by Grant and Glenn Rice. And Glenn Rice, Michigan Wolverines, won the national title by a point over Seton Hall. I believe the score was like 80-79. It was something like that. They got picked up by expansion teams. Nick Anderson. Alonzo Mourning played all 4 years at Georgetown. I believe he went to an Elite 8 in the NCAA tournament. He got selected by the Charlotte Hornet team the year after Charlotte drafted Larry Johnson. Okay. So what I'm getting at is, man, Kendall Gill got drafted by Charlotte Hornets too. Then you had Muggsy Bogues on that team. Then you had Steph Curry. Dale Curry, the father of Steph Curry and Seth Curry. He was on that team. David Wingate was on that team. Johnny Newman, who was a heck of a player, was on that team. And then for the experience, they picked up Robert Parrish from the Boston Celtics. I believe that was Robert Parrish. He played with the Hornets too. And then Orlando Magic. It started off, they had Scott Skiles, who was a point guard from Michigan State. I think to this day he still holds the all-time record for assists in a game. He had like 30 plus assists in the game. I believe he still holds that record to this day. Scott Skiles. This before they drafted Nick Anderson. Now in the expansion draft, they brought in Reggie Lewis, who was a veteran player in the NBA, from the early 80s on. He played with, Chicago Bulls, Atlanta Hawks, and whatnot. I believe he played for the then Kansas City Kings too. So what I'm getting at is expansion did not dilute the talent pool because no superstars in the league were made available in the expansion draft. It was normally like a fourth or fifth starter on the team or a high level reserve player. And on average, one player from every team was made available in the expansion draft. So when you start off as an expansion team, initially, you're going to rely on a player made available in the expansion draft before you actually start drafting your own players. So in theory, it sounded like the talent pool was going to be diluted, but all it really did was take away one rotational player on average from each team, like Showtime Lakers. They had to make a player available in the draft, and that player was Kurt Rambis, who was picked up by the Charlotte Hornets in their first year. And then they drafted Rex Chapman. Rex Chapman from the University of Kentucky. He was a hell of a player. He competed in a dunk contest in 1990, going up against Dominique Wilkins and Kenny Smith and them. And he had hops, and he can play. The same Rex Chapman later on would play for the Miami Heat. So a lot of your top college players during that period, I'm talking about like your elite level college players, they're being picked up by the expansion teams. And if you go back and look at it, like a team like Miami Heat, within 4 years, about the same rate, same progression as you see in Oklahoma City Thunder or the Memphis Grizzlies after the Zach Randolph, Marc Gasol era, when they started to rebuild with Ja Morant around like 2018, 2019. And then by 2021, they broke through and they made the playoffs. And in the next 2 years, they clinched the number 2 seed in the West. Okay. So you look at a team like the Miami Heat. They made the playoffs for the first time as an expansion team in 1992. Now remember, they start off their inaugural season during the 88-89 season. So really, within their fourth year, they became a playoff team. Well, look at the Detroit Pistons of today. Look at the current Detroit Pistons team. Look how much they've improved this year to where they're going to the playoffs. But for the previous 4 years, they were stuck in neutral. Even when they was drafting players, they were stuck in neutral. And I think if that wasn't last year, that was the year before. They broke the all-time consecutive losing streak record in league history. Lost like 27, 28 straight games. Well, look at them now. But previously, over the past 3-4 seasons, they was at the bottom of the standings, right? So they've improved about the same rate that those expansion teams of the late 80s and early 90s did. Okay, so Miami Heat, they broke through. You had Rodney Sacklin on their team. Steve Smith was another highly touted collegiate player from Michigan State, who was one of the best two guards in the NBA throughout the 90s up until During his latter years with the Portland Trailblazers. Steve Smith was a hell of a player, and he was 6'8", and he can shoot with the best of them. And he got picked up by the Miami Heat. Okay, so you had Rodney Cycling on that team, Glenn Rice. That was a nice. Then you had, I believe, I want to say Ramil Robinson was Ramil Robinson from the University of Michigan, and then you had like Bimbo Coles. You had players like that, man, and they broke through and went to the playoffs. And then the Charlotte Hornets, they broke through and went to the playoffs for the first time during the 92-93 season. Also that year, the same Charlotte Hornet team that's featured in this picture here, they were amongst the top teams in the NBA when it came to merchandise sales. And I think for a brief period, they generated more merchandise sales than the back-to-back champion Chicago Bulls. They had they had a very unique style uniform, the teal color with the pinstripes. Man, I saw cats all over sporting Charlotte Hornet gear, the Charlotte Hornet sports jacket, the jersey. That's when NBA jerseys became super popular. That was during the 90s. You know what I'm saying? So what I'm getting at is, man, the Charlotte Hornets became a playoff team. Now look at this lineup here. Larry Johnson. I think he was a 2-time All-American. Like I say, he won the national championship, UNLV. One of the greatest college basketball teams of all time. Me personally, I haven't seen a college basketball team better than UNLV since. And there's been a lot of great college teams over the years. That running Rebel team, man, goodness gracious. Okay, so you had Kendall Gill. You had Alonzo Mourning, Muggsy Bogues. I believe he was from Wake Forest, if I'm not mistaken. Muggsy Bogues, he had the heart of a lion, man. And he would stand up to anyone, and he can play. That's the thing, he could play. He wasn't no gimmick out there, he can play. And like I said, you had Dale Curry, one of the best shooters in the league at that, during that time. They had a well-rounded team, and they had one of the loudest crowds in the NBA. The name of the arena, they call it the Beehive. It was so freaking loud up in there, man, and it was great. The NBA, man, the expansion team that's what really helped the league just take off in a very exponential fashion, along with the Michael Jordan phenomenon and his greatness, and other great established superstars of the league back then. But them expansion teams, man, they helped take the NBA to like another level of popularity. Then here comes the Orlando Magic. After they drafted Shaquille, they had Nick Anderson on the team, Sky Skiles. Okay, and then you bring on Shaq. Now, veteran Tree Rollins, center throughout the league. He played a lot of years for the Atlanta Hawks, and he played a season there with the Detroit Pistons when they was trying to three-peat. Okay, so he was a savvy veteran in the league, and as Shaquille O'Neal said, Tree Rollins, gave him a lot of advice as to how to adjust from college to the NBA. And you had, teams back then, they always had a veteran who can give that advice to rookies, being drafted to their respective teams. Okay, so Shaq comes in. His rookie year, they didn't make the playoffs, but they finished with a record of 41-41. They was 500 that year. And then the next year, they won the number 1 pick, which they used to initially draft Chris Webber, Fab Five, University of Michigan. And then they traded his rights to the Golden State Warriors to acquire the number 3 pick, which they used to bring in Penny Hardaway from the University of Memphis State Tigers. Then they go from 41 wins to 50 wins. They go 50-32 during the 93-94 season. So within 4 years, they became a playoff team, about the same period of improvement that it took the Oklahoma City Thunder from four years ago when they was only winning 24, 25 games to what they're doing right now. It's the same metric of improvement from starting at the bottom, becoming a playoff team. Okay. And then you bring in along the way, you bring in Dennis Scott. Dennis Scott from the University of Georgia Tech. He played with Kenny Anderson, the best point guard in the nation. Kenny Anderson, the best point guard in the nation, coming out of high school. And I believe Kenny Anderson played 2 years of college before he went pro. And he got picked up by the if I'm not mistaken, the New Jersey Nets. But Dennis Scott was known for his three-point shooting. And then they signed free agent Horace Grant from the Chicago Bulls. So do you realize within 5 years, they started off as an expansion team and went to the NBA Finals? They won 59 games that year. Okay. And then by year 6, they go from 59 wins to 60 wins. They go to the conference finals and they lose to the eventual champion, the 72-win Chicago Bulls. Outside of that, they probably, if it weren't for the Bulls, they probably go back to the finals for the second straight year. So the Orlando Magic became a championship contending level team. And it happened fast. So you had 3 teams out of the initial 4 from 88, 89. They became playoff caliber. The Minnesota Timberwolves, it took them a little longer to, kind of get established. So 3 out of 4 teams in that period, I would say that's an amazing success when it comes to expansion. And like I said, by the end of the 90s, after they acquired Stephon Marbury, that's when Minnesota became a playoff team. It carried over to the 2000s. Okay. Now, they became so successful that the league, I believe, did accelerate expansion by adding the 2 Canadian teams. I do believe they brought those teams on too fast. I think they probably should have waited till the end of the decade before you add in the 2 Canadian teams, which was the Vancouver Grizzlies. They brought in players like Brian Reeves from Oklahoma State. They call him Big Country Reeves, the center for. And then later on they would bring in people like, if I'm not mistaken, Sharif Abdul-Rahim, which I thought he was a heck of a player. I was a big fan of his. And then the Toronto Raptors, of course, they started their franchise. Isaiah Thomas was the president of the basketball operations, and he drafted Damon Stoudemire, Mighty Mouse, I believe from the University of Arizona. And then later on, they bring in Tracy McGrady, and then you got to that Vince Carter, and then the Toronto Raptors, quiet as it kept, they became a playoff level team also within 4 years. So I take that back. I take that back. They became playoff level team within 4 years. They carried over to like the beginning of 2000, Vince Sanity went in the dunk contest, and then they went to the playoffs like in 2000 and 2001 during the Vince Carter years. They lost in the conference semifinals to the Philadelphia 76ers in 7 games, led by Allen Iverson during his MVP year, and he led Philadelphia to the finals. So if you really go back and look at it, I was thinking in my mind that the 2 Canadian teams were added on too soon, but in actuality, one of those 2 teams became playoff level within 4 years. So it's really the same rate as the initial 4 of the new wave of expansion that started in 1988. So this notion that the talent was diluted is a misnomer, because those franchises built their teams up really through college, not trying to sign a whole bunch of free agents, because it wasn't set up that way. You had to build through the draft. Like I said, T-Mac, he came right out of high school, but of course Vince Carter, North Carolina. And then, like I said, you had Big Country Reeves for the Grizzlies, and then eventually they would relocate to Memphis, become the Memphis Grizzlies, and then the Raptors, they stayed in Toronto, where they're still at, and they won their first championship back in 2019. So when you really look at it, the misnomer is the league became the revisionists will try to convince newfound fans that expansion made the league weak. No, the league was just as strong as ever, but the difference was, if you go back and look at it, the Orlando Magics, the Charlotte Hornets, the Miami Heat, especially when they got Alonzo Mourning from Charlotte. When the Miami Heat signed Alonzo Mourning as a free agent, then they took it to another level. Then they brought in players like Jamal Mashburn, who was originally drafted by the Dallas Mavericks. And then Dan Marley from the Phoenix Suns. Next thing you know, they went in 60 games. They won 61 games in 1997 and went to the conference finals only to lose to the defending champion Chicago Bulls, who won 69 games that season in their own right. And then they won like 55 games the next year, and then it carried over to the new decade. And then they had to regroup a couple years, and they brought in Dwayne Wade, and we kind of know how that went. So what I'm saying is the Miami Heat became the Eastern Conference foe during the late 90s, like starting in 1996. So the league didn't get weaker. It was just as solidified and stronger than ever. But the difference was your expansion teams became more successful and were better than the staple franchises of the late 80s, the Lakers, the Celtics, and the Pistons. Now, remember, the Lakers had to start rebuilding around 1993. You know, Magic had retired in 91, and then the last remaining cornerstone figure of the Showtime Lakers, James Worthy, he retired in 93. So they had to start all over again. Like Byron Scott was gone at that time. AC Green, you know, he left the Lakers, started playing. Ironically, he started playing with Phoenix during the latter years, and then they brought AC Green back during the 2000 championship run with Kobe and Shaq. So they had to start over. So during that period, a team like, let's say, the Orlando Magic became better than the Lakers. And then Boston, Bird retired, McHale retired, Parrish had moved on. They had Reggie Lewis, he passed away prematurely. So they had to start all over again. And then the Pistons, after Isaiah Thomas retired during the 93-94 season, then they had to start over again, drafting a Grant Hill and the Allen Houstons of the world. And it took them 3 years before they started becoming playoff level again. So when you really look at it, man, it's just that the league was just as strong and competitive, but it was newfound teams that took over the landscape from what we used to seeing. But the constant, especially in the Eastern Conference, were the Chicago Bulls, especially when Michael Jordan came back from playing baseball and they racked off another three-peat. So the competition that Jordan faced during that time, it was just as strong than the competition that we saw between the superstars of the 80s. It was just as strong. It's just that the Magic and the Bird, they had their time. You see what I'm saying? The Dr. J's retired in 87. Kareem retired in 89. So all that happened was you just had a new generation of players that took over the scene. You know, and then Jordan, you know, and the Bulls, they finally beat the Pistons going into a new decade. And it wasn't that the Pistons was super old, because when the Bulls beat them in 91, the Pistons were the back-to-back champions and advanced to the conference finals. It wasn't like the Pistons got beat in the first round. They went to the conference finals. They succumbed to attrition in a team that generated that attrition over the previous 3 years. And then the Bulls built up enough resolve and determination where they finally beat them. That's what you call competition. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm getting at, people, is I just want to break that down, man. The expansion in the 90s, it did not dilute the talent pool. It didn't say, well, we're going to make Charles Barkley available in the expansion. Like the Pistons, the player that they had to make available in the expansion was Rick Mahorn. Now, he was part of their first championship run, and he was a starter, but he was like a 4th, 5th level starter. You see what I'm saying? Like he won, like Isaiah was number 1 guy, Dumont was number 2 guy, Aguirre was number 3 guy, Lambert was number 4 guy, Mahorn was number 5 guy. Well, they had to make someone available, so they had to make Rick Mahorn available, but they still went back to back, because what they did was they took Dennis Rodman and inserted him into the starting lineup. Then you still had Buda Edwards. So it all it did was take one rotational player away from each team to establish those expansion teams starting out. And then as those expansion teams drafted their own players, they became just as good as the staple franchise, just as competitive. That's why I say people, these talking heads that cover the NBA now, man, they doing a disservice, man, because they trying to discredit the whole era. You can't do that. You can't do that. Especially you can't pass that by people who already know, who actually grew up during that time and experienced that. The NBA, it was awesome in the 80s, man. It was awesome in the 90s though. And it was great in the 2000s. You see what I'm saying? And it could have been just as great in this past decade, but this is the era where superstars started to team up. So what was beautiful about the 90s was, and I believe this is because of the Jordan effect. Jordan raised the bar for everybody, meaning that by the end of the 80s, when the Pistons implemented the Jordan rules, because they knew that's the only way they can slow him down. Instead of averaging 35, 36 against them, the Jordan rules basically said, okay, you're not going to get no more than 30 on us. That's basically what the Jordan rules did. It eliminated 6 extra points a game that Jordan would normally score against them if it wasn't for the Jordan rules. So what I'm saying is, he raised the bar to such a degree where going into the next decade, because of his impact as a player in the NBA, entering the 90s, there became more of an emphasis on defense. And that's where you start seeing the scoring, like point per game averages, come down. It wasn't because of a lack of talent. It was because of the expansion. It's because of the extra emphasis on defense, because the top dog of the league practically demanded it. Or you weren't going to beat them. And you still weren't going to beat them at the end of the day. So that's why Knicks, by the end of the 80s, they was more of an offensive team. Patrick Ewing, you had people on that team like, Mark Jackson, Johnny Newman, Gerald Bustaf, people like that. It was more like a fast-paced team. Well, by the time the early 90s started, when Pat Riley became the coach, he said, man, look, we got to deal with Jordan. So he started bringing in the Anthony Masons of the world. You had Charles Oakley there. You know what I'm saying? You had Patrick Ewing there, and then you start bringing in Doc Rivers, Derek Harper, Rolando Blackman. You drafted Anthony Bonner. Then you bring in the John Starks. You see what I'm getting at? They became more defensive oriented because they felt that was the best path to try to, overtake Jordan, specifically in the Eastern Conference. So what I'm saying, they created a situation where it became superstar, literally superstar versus superstar. And that's why you had those magical matchups in the finals where the billing was Jordan versus Magic, Jordan versus Clyde, Jordan versus Barkley. So it became defensive oriented for the most part. And then is your superstar going to outplay Jordan? That's what it came down to. And then during the second three-peat, as Pippen matured as a player, because he did mature. Them 2 years Jordan was away playing baseball, Pippen did mature. He showed who he was. So when Jordan came back, it was like Jordan and Pippen versus Sean Kemp and Gary Payton. And then Jordan Pippen versus Malone and Stockton. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm getting at, people, is Jordan raised the bar so high during the age of expansion. That's what gives these revisionists the impression that expansion made the league weak. In all actuality, it was a sign of growth. Because if the 80s were not as good as it was, people would not have thought that they was in position to expand and add those teams the way they did. Expansion built on that principle was a good thing. And I'm telling you, man, the Orlando Magic took off. They were just, look, you had 2 superstars on Orlando Magic. They was getting just as many commercials during that time as Jordan. Shaq. They call him Shaq Diesel during that time. And then Penny with the Eric Penny commercials. When Chris Rock was doing the voiceovers and stuff. Then the Charlotte Hornets, they had 2 stars in their own right. Many people thought that Alonzo Mourning he had a better rookie season than Shaquille O'Neal. And when I look at the numbers, looking back on it, I believe he did because his rookie year, he led his team to the playoffs. I thought Alonzo Mourning should have got Rookie of the Year. Alonzo Mourning was better during the beginning of his career than let's say during his latter years. I mean, as far as what he did out there on the court, he was actually better. But I think when he went to Miami, he was asked to focus more on defense. Therefore, his numbers, his rookie year, he was averaging about 23 a game. By the time he got to Miami, he was doing like 20 a game because he was asked to focus on defense more to try to compete with the Bulls. So that's why I say Michael Jordan raised the bar, man. You had to bring your A+ game to even have a chance. But see, during this previous era, it produced the exact opposite effect. That's why during the Jordan years, with the expansion, with the newfound teams, the Charlotte Hornets, with the teal color, with the pinstripes, the Orlando Magic broke out with the pinstripes too. The popularity of the NBA went through the roof, man. I'm telling you. I'm sitting there telling you. And those newfound teams, they got just as much coverage. Their games were televised at the same rate as the Chicago Bulls and New York Knicks. You will see Orlando Magic on the regular, the Charlotte Hornets, the Miami Heat, along with the Bulls, Knicks. Phoenix Suns was popular because of Charles Barkley. Then the Sonics, Rockets, Jazz, Blazers. I can go on and on and on. And then as the Lakers started to improve, with Nick Van Exel, Eddie Jones, and them, then they started televising their games. And then when Shaq went west, and you bring in Kobe Bean, then here come the Lakers again. You know what I'm saying? And then the Pistons started to build back up with, as I said, with Grant Hill, Terry Mills, who they drafted, and then like I said, Allen Houston out of University of Tennessee. And then here come Detroit. You know what I'm saying? And then, like I said, you had a young Minnesota Timberwolves team. Oh, wait a minute. They had Kevin Garnett. Then you had J.R. Wright. You see what I'm saying? And then later on, you bring in Stephon Marbury, and by the end of the 90s, they become playoff level. And like I said, Toronto Raptors, I actually forgot. By the time they got Vince Carter, they started going to the playoffs. So the expansion during that time, you had newfound teams taking over the landscape, which brought more excitement to the league. And then as the Lakers started to resurge, as the Pistons started to resurge, and then, Boston by the early 2000s with Antoine Walker and Walter McCarty, and then a young Paul Pierce, and then, like I said, but throughout the 90s, man, it was a beautiful decade of the NBA, man. And don't let these talking heads, man, don't let these talking heads fool you, man. Because they try and discredit that whole era because Jordan dominated, and that's when the Bulls won. And if you have to go that route and try to discredit the era, something's wrong. And 2-1, there's a con job being hatched. But that's why I just want to rehash on this, man. Expansion did not dilute the talent. All it did throughout the course of starting off, all it really did was initially give your top team some extra victories during the regular season. But come playoff time, the top teams still going to wind up playing each other. But as the expansion teams got better, there were no gimme games. At that point, it was pretty much, at that point, whose star player was going to play better to lead a team to victory. So it was an initial boost as far as victory total for those top teams. But in the end, the top teams still had to wind up playing each other to see who was the best. Then as Orlando got better, Charlotte got better, Miami got better, then they weren't looked at no expansion teams no more. They were full-fledged NBA squad, ready to compete as challengers for the championship. But they trying to do all this as revisionists to discredit one Michael Jordan. That competition was not weak. And I'm sitting there telling you, it was just as good as the 80s. Only difference was you had expansion teams taking over the landscape. Go back and research about the Charlotte Hornets and read them articles, pull up information about how good they became, especially by the time they got Alonzo Mourning, man. That team was doing good, and they was exciting, and they was competitive. Matter of fact, In 93, they won in the first round because Mourning hit a game-winning shot that clinched their series versus Boston, and they lost to the Knicks, who was at their peak with a prime Patrick Ewing. John Starks was balling that year. They brought over Charles Smith from the Clippers to be the power forward. You had Rolando Blackman, who was a big-time veteran player from the Dallas Mavericks, and you had one of your better point guards from the 80s in Doc Rivers, because he got to play with Dominique down there in Atlanta with the Hawks. And that team, the New York Knicks, won 60 games, had the best record in the Eastern Conference. That's who the Hornets lost to when they first, doing their first playoff run. And make it so bad, that was their first playoff run, and they advanced to the second round. And they took a little dip after Lonzo Mourning left over a contract dispute and went to Miami, but they bounced back in the next couple of years with Glenn Rice and Anthony Mason and Vlade Divac, and they advanced to the second round only to lose to the back-to-back champion Chicago Bulls. So when those expansion teams were losing, well, 2-1, they were losing to the Bulls. Just like everybody else was. So I enjoy doing this video right here, man. It's important because they trying to erase history, people, but there's too many cats out there that know what's up, man. I'm telling you, that expansion wave, it was strong. That's why they added four. Think about that. They didn't just add 2 teams, they added 4 teams because the league was so good and it became so profitable and so successful. That's what let them say, you know what, we can add 4 teams in 2 years. And then 5 years later, we're going to add 2 Canadian teams. And then make the league weak. It made the league, in some terms, more competitive because now it's contingent on your superstar, your number one guy leading the way. Now in the 80s, you had that too. But the 90s dynamic, I just think it had its own unique competitive standpoint that was just as good as what we saw in the 80s. You just had different faces. That's all. Led by one top dog who, once he broke through, it didn't matter who he gonna play. And one more thing, and I'm gonna shut this down. They'll say, well, Jordan couldn't beat the Celtics or the Pistons. If you look at the regular season, the Bulls always gave, and I'm a Laker fan to the core, man, but I believe in upholding history. I watched highlights of the 2 matchups during the regular season of the Bulls and the Lakers. And the Lakers was back-to-back champions that year. The Bulls beat the Lakers both times during the regular season. Michael Jordan first game versus the Boston Celtics, I believe he beat them. His first game as a rookie versus the Detroit Pistons, I believe he beat them. His first game as a rookie versus the Showtime Lakers, he beat them. Because of its competitive nature. What I'm trying to say, people, is when you peel back the layers, man, this dude was the truth from day freaking one, man. He had to establish the organization from the ground up and be the sole force behind the Bulls until they brought in Scotties, until they brought in Horace Grant. And then they had to grow stage by stage. But he was leading the way the whole time. And then once Pippen said, I'm ready to be the number 2 guy from here on out. And then Grant, like, I'm gonna be your lunch pail guy as the number 3 guy. Everybody played their role going to the 90s, man. The Pistons knew they weren't gonna hold them off no more. You see what I'm saying? And that's why when he won that first championship in 91, in your heart of hearts, man, if you was a newfound, for all newfound fans, if you can go back in time and start watching the NBA and got a chance to watch that experience, you will know just by watching Jordan play that when he broke through that first time, wasn't nobody gonna beat him. You can close shop. It wasn't gonna happen. until he decided to say, well, as he said, I had no more challenges. I'm going to retire, go play another sport. Then you felt you had a chance. But expansion was a great thing, man. It was very exciting for the league, and it was beautiful about it. They showcased all them teams, man. They promoted all the stars. Whoever came in the league during that time that had expectations, Derek Coleman's, Purvis Ellison's, number 1, number 2 picks of the draft, Stacey Altman, the plastic man from UNLV, whoever it was, and David Robinson, of course, Shaq, Chris Jackson, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, whoever it was, man, Mookie Blaylock from University of Oklahoma, Stacey King, B.J. Armstrong, whoever it was, David Rivers, the international players, Vlade Divac, Tony Kukoc, what's his name? Jonas Marcelonis, Golden State, Chris Mullin from St. John's. Whoever entered the NBA during that time, man, they promoted them. They didn't like hype them as they promoted them as who they was coming out of college and what their reputation was. Big Dog Robinson, Ramil Robinson. And then the high school players, the Kobe Beans, the KGs, you know what I'm saying, Kevin Garnett, whoever it was, man. It was a beautiful time, dog. And if the NBA got back to that, I'm telling you, man, it'll have another great era. They just need to step out. They need to get out the way and let the NBA flow. But just for the record, the expansion of the 90s, it's the total opposite of what the revisionists are trying to paint. It was a sign of growth and it was a sign of success. And them expansion teams, it really only took them about 4 years. In some cases, 3. But let's just say 3 to 4 years, like the normal timetable of a rebuild for an established franchise. And next thing you know, they rocking and rolling, competing. And in Orlando's case, they went to the finals within 5 years. You got teams out there that ain't been to the finals. And they still plugging along. And Orlando cracked through in record time. So I just wanna drop that, man. And it just needed to be known. I just want to drop that nugget. And until next time, leave comments and thoughts. This is JB for BTB, Behind the Bench.